Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Rebecca Dingo. I'm an associate professor in women's and gender studies and in English. And I'm really excited to be part of this panel today because my own work is really interested in how we document and tell stories about human rights violations and the kinds of dominant narratives that we hear over and over again. And so I'm hoping we'll get a little bit into that conversation today. So I want to just quickly introduce the panel members. The first person whose name I'm going to try not to butcher is Laurent Bécue-Renard. Is that close enough? Close enough in my American accent. Well, he's known for his work on Bosnia and Herzegovina, which reflects on the psychic traces of the war and films the grief work undertaken by Bosnian women in the context of psychotherapy. In 2003, his film From Weary to Wars was presented at 50 international festivals, and it received the Film Award of Peace, awarded by the Heinrich Böll Foundation. In 2014, he released his second film of Men in War, which was an official selection at Cannes and is showing this weekend at True False. Next to him, we have Anne Hornaday, who works for the Washington Post. She's a native of Des Moines, Iowa, and a graduate of Smith College. She began working for Ms. Magazine before becoming a freelance writer in New York City, where she eventually began to write about movies for the New York Times Arts and Leisure section and other publication. She then became a movie critic at the Austin American Statesman before moving to Baltimore to become the movie critic at the Baltimore Sun. She was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism in 2008. And then the third person we have on our panel is Mo Scarpelli, who is an alumni of the University of Missouri School of Journalism, so welcome back today.
Thanks.
And she is a Brooklyn-based filmmaker and multimedia journalist. She uses character-driven stories to connect people, challenge notions, and shared perspectives on global issues. Mo's journalism work has been published with the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, Africa Review, the Huffington Post, and Narratively. And also, you have a film that you've just finished, which
it's
do you
premiering not here, unfortunately. It's premiering next week at South by Southwest.
And can you tell us the title of it? Or
it's called Frame by Frame.
Frame by Frame,
about 4 Afghan photojournalists building free press in Afghanistan.
Yes, great. So that is this is our panelists for today. So the first question that I had is that I was thinking about the ethics of depicting violence, and how is it as filmmakers and critics, how should we ethically represent violence? Because we're in a world that is saturated with it. There's video games with violence. We see on the TV news violence over and over again. But then also, I mean, this is from my interest in the work, is that oftentimes the stories that circulate are based on violent episodes. So how do we tell about violence in a way that not only can depict the atrocity of violence, but also to talk about the context around violence? So I'll go ahead and and let me know if you want to show any clips, and I will go ahead and pull them up when you're ready for those. Oh,
I'll go.
Jump in.
Well, I think, it's interesting. I usually write about the issues of violence and the portrayal of violence in the context of feature fiction films. So it's interesting to kind of think about it in the context of a nonfiction film. But I do think some of the same principles apply, which is what you said, Rebecca. It's context. It's also a matter of are you using violence to perpetuate that symbolic system that we seem to be kind of addicted to, or to question it? And are you really creating empathy? I mean, I'm kind of looping back to something that Joshua Oppenheimer talked about yesterday, which is that empathy is not necessarily the same thing as sympathy. So are you creating a space for people to experience grief and emotional connection with both the victim and even the perpetrator, rather than kind of succumbing to these same old conventional tropes that we all know from sensationalistic and objectifying and exploitative forms of violence. And I also think, are you interested in are you creating a person rather than just a screen object? And that kind of gets into this kind of question that we've been entertaining for the last day and a half, which is consent. I mean, I'm very squeamish about bodies, the use of bodies to send a message or to indict something. I mean, it can be for very good causes, but I'd like to kind of get the filmmaker's perspective on that, on navigating those tensions. That's all I got for now.
I have like many thoughts floating around, but I think one thing that's important is to just make a conscious choice as media makers, both in the news, and this is harder, I think, for journalists who are under pressure with, trying to get a story out that's going to cover an atrocity or cover something that is newsworthy. The violent part of things is usually the most newsworthy thing, unfortunately, is what we decided. And yes, we should know about bombings, and we should know about the awful things that are happening in the world. We should be knowing about these things. That's like why journalism matters. But at the same time, we have to make a conscious decision, I think, to approach the story differently and not always succumb so succinctly to if it bleeds, it leads, like literally bleeds, it leads. So, I mean, I ran into, just from a personal perspective, I ran into this with Frame by Frame. We have 4 photographers who have lived through, and not just in their journalism work, in their lives, have lived through ongoing war for, some of them, their whole lives in Afghanistan. And different wars, different kinds of atrocities, different kinds of manipulation of humans around them, that, human rights infringements, like right and left. And so that's something that they have to navigate that in their work, right? Like, they know the international news is looking for a story that is like this horrific, like, violent thing, because there's a lot of things to cover in the world. And when does the U.S. pay attention to Afghanistan? Oh, when there's a bombing, or when. So anyway, they're trying to combat that, and that really resonated with myself and my co-director Alexandria when we were putting together the film. One of the characters has shot in secret during the Taliban, and actually has some. I don't know if you know, but the Taliban completely banned all photography and any kind of videography or coverage of the human image. They said it was haram, or it was blasphemy. And really, that was an excuse to basically shut off people's opportunity to share what was happening. And so during the Taliban regime, there were no photographers, but one of our characters believed it was important to document what was happening, so he did it anyway. And there were some awful things happening, and he did get them on tape, and he gave us this footage that's never been shown before, and we came to this place where everyone around us, when we put the film together in our rough cuts for a year, we had people coming to us and saying, lead with this footage. This is what everyone wants to see. And we stuck to our guns, and we're really, really serious about the fact that, no, we want you to get to know Najibullah, this man, as a human first, and as his present human self in Kabul, with like a lot of other very interesting things actually happening. They just didn't have to do with genocide in Afghanistan that he had filmed before. So we had to make this choice, did we want to lead with something that was bleeding? And I think we made the right choice. I mean, you can see the film and decide for yourself, I guess. But I think you have to earn it in a way. Like, what? I don't know. And when it comes to storytelling, I'm kind of like going off on a tangent here, but what human, like, when you meet them, the first thing they tell you is like the most awful thing that ever happened to them? Nobody. But that's like always the way we hear about violence, is like the act comes first, and then, oh, then people were affected. And it's like, no, people were affected. People are people, first of all, and then they were affected, and this is the violence. So it comes back to the context. But I think also just really, I totally resonate with what you're saying about a human, and like coming back to the person and the people involved with atrocity. So yeah, that was just one example, I guess, from my film.
In my own country, I think I belong to the first generation who grew up with the 6 o'clock news on TV, which was at 8 o'clock actually. Since I was a child, I grew up with scenes of war on TV. Vietnam, then Afghanistan, then Iraq, Iran, and I think when I was a grown-up, I started to think over these images, and I turned off the TV, I think 25 years ago, and I don't watch it anymore, the news, because what started in my mind is that, what is it really telling me about the people that are supposedly at stake on screen, what is it telling me about myself? And I thought that the news was never telling me anything about what each of us bear in terms of violence, in terms of legacy of war. And it's also never telling us anything about what it is to be a human being and being in the course of war. Because human beings we see most of the time on the news are just part of an explanation of what, where, how this war is going on, but never about what is the part of the human experience that is at stake here. So later on, I was asked to be the editor-in-chief of a magazine that was broadcasted on the internet out of Sarajevo, besieged Sarajevo. So I spent the last year of the war in Sarajevo at a time, 1995, where internet was just big at the beginning stage. And so I was the editor-in-chief for news, but there were not, of course, images. It was printed news. But my own contribution to that site was short stories, in the sense of literary short stories. And I was trying to depict those two questions, what it is to be a human being and be in the course of the war, and what is it telling about myself. And at one stage, I thought that literature was not really conveying for me what I was trying to. And when the war was over, after a few weeks, I was still in Bosnia. I met a therapist who was working with young widows who had lost more than 50 men, usually in the course of the war, and in their families. And I was really, really interested, because I thought, wow, she's doing therapy. So I asked her, can I come and sit with you for a session? And she said, come over. And she had a group session with 15 women. And I knew that lasted for 3 hours, I think. And I knew it was exactly that I had been seeking for so many years. People who were just trying to figure out how to name what is war, what war is doing to the psyche, and finding words and ways to tell a story. And this, for me, was exactly that, what was missing, not only in the news and in the way I had myself talked about the war during the war, but also about what was missing since I was a child. Namely, all of us, I mean, all our families went through 2 world wars and other conflicts. And I think it's very rare in a family that there are stories about what people have felt. There are stories about what happened sometimes. And most of the time, even those stories are not there. But what they have felt, what it has made them, how it has turned the course of their lives. This is something, we just grow around these people who are our grandparents and our parents, and it's like a secret, Of course, there's no plot in the family, but it's never but it's there. It's inside ourselves. It has shaped the psyche of the family. It has shaped who we are, and it's never addressed. So that's how all my work as a filmmaker started. And as you mentioned, I did this first film following these women during the full course of their therapy. I picked up 3 women of a group of 15 that I followed for 9 months. There was a 9-month therapy program, and after I did that, of course, I started the second project, which is the one which is shown here. What it is to be, the question for me was, after having worked on what it is to be a woman, how women are shaped by the war, I wanted to work on the counterpart and what it is to be a man, go to war, fight in the war, come back.
I think something that connects what both of you have talked about is I think it's rescuing people from being objects. And it's also deep listening. And I feel like often, because film is a visual medium, it's an inherently objectifying medium. So that has to be part of the project of a filmmaker, is to just be aware of that and to constantly try to, you know, do restorative work around that. Right. And that's the best ones do.
Actually, can I turn that sort of into a question? Because how is it? So one of the things that I noticed in some of the more popularized documentary films that I look at, particularly around girls and girls' empowerment, is that they tend to be a pretty prescriptive narrative that focuses on a singular girl who makes some sort of change in her world. But while we get sort of a deep, effective connection with that girl, what tends for me to be missing is how do we place her in the world that she is in, and then the wider world too. So how is it as filmmakers that how have you sort of approached that to not do that sort of objectification? Like what are the kinds of the thematic moves that you make to demonstrate the context that they're in?
Let's see. With frame by frame, actually you bring up. Maybe I should play the clip actually because it's Farzana's.
Which one would you
like her introduction? The first one. I think it's just called O1 frame by frame something. Oh, and it's going to be rough. I had to like chop, export, so it's going to be rough. So the quality's not great either.
As an Afghan woman, especially when I was in Canada studying, also when I went to US and Europe, I realized that the images that comes from Afghanistan about women, I felt that it's not the complete image. What I'm trying to do is to focus deeper in the life of Afghan women. Not just showing one side of their lives. There should be stories about the little changes that Afghan women experienced in the last 10 years. Photographing women is a very sensitive thing in Afghanistan. Most Afghan doesn't like their wives to be photographed. So in some parts, it's the culture that they shouldn't be seen. Once I did receive some threats that why I'm filming and photographing women. I shouldn't be doing that, and I should be questioned and jailed for that. Sometimes I get to the point that I even question this decision, that okay, if I die, is it worth it? I think for me it's very important right now to be in Afghanistan and to be documenting, because what I can do for this country, I think it will be much harder for others to do. And some points it gets impossible for Afghan men photographers because they are men and they can't get access. No one else can do it, I think, at the moment.
So that's Farzana. She's basically the lead. There's 4 Afghan journalists in the film, but she's kind of the heroine. So Farzana, I guess with this particular film, I always run into the issue of shooting stories, and I shoot a lot of stuff in developing countries, and it is really hard to put the girl and the woman into context. It's super hard. And I never felt like I could really do it justice the way that I felt like we could in frame by frame because of Farzana. Because her job, and she takes it very seriously, is to cover women. Because like she said, men can't photograph women in Afghanistan. And she's only one of a very, very few number of female photojournalists in Afghanistan who are Afghan. So she has this really special access to women, and her framing of women, even if it wasn't one that we agreed with, the fact that we get to watch an Afghan woman frame other Afghan women was so helpful putting women into context, because this was massive for us, being in Afghanistan, shooting there and seeing just the way, I don't know, the situation that women are in or seem to be in, right? And I'm a foreigner, so I don't truly know. It was a big it was a big concern for us, and it just seemed like a no-brainer to follow Farzana. First of all, because she's just interesting and has amazing work, but also that she is in this really, really special, unique place in the world to tell the story of Afghan women.
Were the pictures that you, the still images, were those her images?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting because what I appreciate about them is that there's such a variety of photos that we see of women, and that, in the United States, that's what we see is a variety. I mean, and that's not typically what we see about Afghan women. I mean,
Right.
even for somebody who is in women's and gender studies, and I know that Afghan women are very diverse, like to begin with, women boxing is
Right.
a great sort
Right.
of way to show that.
Yeah, and she covers the gamut, so we also knew that it would be really interesting to shoot with her. And at the same time, she doesn't, this is all about, contextualizing women too. She doesn't shy away from the fact that women in Afghanistan are very well known for the burqa. And so she was, like, when she was talking about traveling, she studied in Canada for 2 years, and that's where she understood, this narrative. When she got out of Afghanistan, she was like, holy shit, this is what the world thinks of women in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And then she was like, she just saw this fascination that we really have, and that a lot of countries have about the burqa, because it's such a unique thing in the world to cover somebody like just full. And when I say burqa, I'm not talking about a headscarf. I'm talking about the full. In Afghanistan, usually or in Kabul, it was blue, but like the full veil, totally covering everything with like a little bit of mesh. And so she knew that this was this narrative that was forming, that all women wear a burqa, and that burqa equals, oppression and all these other things. And sometimes, yes, but she was like, it's way more complicated than that. There's a lot of history in it. There's a lot of protecting women from being raped during the Soviet invasion. There's a lot of like tons of layers of things here, and like we saw tons of women walking around by themselves with a burqa and like high heels on and like glittery dresses underneath and stuff. So there's this and there's no way we could even scratch the surface as foreign. I mean, we're women, so that helps, but like as foreigners.
Yeah.
And anyway, she did this award-winning series on the burqa, where she follows where it's coming from, who's pleating it, the whole process, and like where it's most used in Afghanistan. And these really like kind of interesting images of, if you look up Farzana Wahidi, is her name, Wahidi. Her burqa work is online, but it's pretty fascinating stuff to see this very dehumanized form, which is just naturally what, to me, the burqa looks like. It's just like, you can't see a human. It looks like you're wearing a ghost costume or something. And then doing very human things, like going shopping and like talking trash about the girl around the corner and like holding a baby and like all this stuff. So she has this great series. I would look it up. But anyway, so yeah, I guess going back to Farzana, like being the voice for those women, I think that's why she does what she does. So.
And I think that you really demonstrated then that wider context
Hopefully, yeah.
of the single story. Lauren, do you want to show your clip, maybe?
I remember my vehicle stopping. I see this figure about 25 meters away from me running across toward the tree line. I leveled my weapon, led my target. I pulled the trigger. Maybe a minute or so, there's no more fire. Myself and a bunch of other guys went out, checked for bodies. I remember the guy that was running along. Never found a weapon, so I don't know if that means he had a weapon. He was just a fucker in the wrong place at the wrong time. Don't know. Don't know, don't care. He was running, I shot him.
Well, you care something, or something goes on because it makes you feel.
At the time, I didn't.
Right.
Yeah, we picked him up, putting him in the body bag. Big chunk of his brain fell onto my boot. My buddy looked at me, looked at him, smiled. I said, what? He ain't gonna need it. He's going in the glad bag. It's not like I knew what he looked like before he got shot. I just know what he looked like after. And he didn't look all that fucking pretty. And that whole eye trick thing, trying to close their fucking eyes, that shit doesn't always work.
So you try to close his eyes?
Well, the one eye he had, he just kept looking at me. Then I had to make a bad joke about it just to get through it.
His eye was open, but you know that he really wasn't really looking at you.
Sure did seem like he was looking at me.
Well, of course. But you were dealing with what you saw, the shock of that.
So that's why I don't sleep.
Because if you sleep, what?
I see him.
When I said earlier that I turned the television off 25 years ago, I also turned my back to information and news. So I find it interesting that you invite me today in the school. It's not that I think information is bad. I think if we need information on a subject, it's good to have good information. But we're not specialists of everything. And there's one thing that matters is who we are and what is the experience of being a human being. And we are here just for a very short time, so we better learn who we really are. So, and I think in terms of representation of human violence and the war on television, the more we see information, normal information, the less we know about it, and the further away we go from what we bear inside. And it's like when we see the news, it's kind of, there's a different species over there, wherever it is, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and they are meant to go through war. Like if, again, we were not already having all this inside of us. So, and I think there's a big misunderstanding between a victim or a person who's been involved in the war and the viewer of the news. And there's a big misunderstanding, sorry, not with the viewer, with the journalist most of the time, because of course the journalist is doing his work, namely asking questions to, again, what, where, how. But this is not the questions a human being who's been exposed to war is asking himself or herself. And that's why I was so fascinated the first time I met this Bosnian therapist, because what was at stake was the questions they were trying to ask themselves about the meaning of that experience and how to find a meaning, how to name things, and that has determined also a path as a filmmaker that I was really interested to follow on the questions people were asking themselves and never to answer my own questions. So I don't ever do any interview. And I decided, I don't know what's going to be the future of my filmmaking, but I felt that this place I built for my films, namely to introduce the camera in the therapeutic process and to have this camera be part of the therapy and and be used by not only by the therapist in a way, but mostly by the patient themselves, was what I wanted to do. So, because in both films, we as a viewer, we see the intimate journey and how war is affecting deeply the person, and how by telling their story, their way, it's always telling our story, the ones that we have received as a legacy.
You know, I think that one of the things that has come up in conversation is the kind of one rift between journalism and documentary filmmaking. And, you know, it seems to me that if there's some way to bring those two together, like what would it look like for you as a filmmaker to have your work used in a news context? Like, and not just you, but Mo too. I mean, and is there a way that journalists can either draw on like the documentary film perspective and use that as to tell a better story, even in that short clip? Like, and I think that this is something that actually I think our School of Journalism may be sort of thinking about now, especially as we're opening this new documentary journalism's, you know, center.
Well, as a freelancer, to me, a lot depends on the editor.
Yeah.
Like, you can find that some outlets are open to something that has a little more breath and like allows you to let characters breathe and have more character moments, I guess, to really like tap into the human more. And then there's those who don't.
Yeah.
And I think also the newsworthiness, it's always going to be a problem to try to bring up things that are just culturally not discussed or not they're like not put in the forefront. Like the issues that the soldiers dealing with are not things that like we talk and hear about all the time. And so newsworthiness is always going to be this in its current in journalism. I can't see that changing anytime soon. The fact that like newsworthy has its own definition and that contradicts these bigger, larger questions of ourselves and our identities as humans, because that's just what newsworthiness is. So, and sometimes that also means that we're missing out on stories that are just not news, like we're not hearing about the aftermath of war because it's not newsworthy. We're not hearing about what happened after the troops left. In fact, that's a huge concern in Afghanistan. The troops and media and aid, like all of it is leaving soon and has already left, started leaving. And then what stories are we telling? Okay, we're gonna move on to the next atrocity. But I don't know, I see that newsworthiness, it's always gonna have its own definition. And therefore, the people who make it are going to rise to that definition of those institutions that hold that up because they want to get their story on the news and they want to get paid and do their job.
Can I offer something?
Yeah, please.
You know, one, I agree that newsworthiness, you know, it's a very, it's connected to the objectivity myth, if you want to call it, or framework, which is another way of objectifying. It's a very instrumental relationship with subjects. It's, you know, what this clip illustrates is the difference between interviewing and listening. You know, this is listening. This is deep, deep listening. And to offer readers or, you know, your audience as a journalist an opportunity for that kind of deep experience may not be able to happen in that kind of A1, you know, who, what, where, when model, but I do think that there's space for that in features, you know, what we call features in our newspaper, which is, you know, and now that we're getting into multimedia spaces and we're telling stories with images and sounds and movement, I can totally see a place for this. And I think there is a really big opportunity for documentary filmmakers and essay filmmakers to teach my colleagues, you know, because I actually do think that there's a place for it and a hunger for it.
Yeah, I think that it's really, I was thinking about this clip that we just saw, which is such an intense, I think, clip, at least for me to watch, that, you know, we were talking about context, and oftentimes we think about context as being more of the political, the economic kind of realms of things, but actually what that clip for me offers is, you know, in the United States we hear a lot about veterans coming home and not receiving services, and they have post-traumatic stress disorder, that, there's all this funding that's cut to support them, but we don't ever see what that actually looks like, on a day-to-day basis. And I think that your clip provides, I think, that human emotional side to not just care, that it gives an extra sort of level of care that an audience can have about an issue that is, I think, missing in that mainstream kind of coverage of those kind of issues.
I do agree with what you said. I guess there's space somewhere. But I think that there's a need then that the filmmaker, wherever he puts himself as a subjective filmmaker or an objective news reporter, should never forget that he's part of the experience as well, and whatever his editor is asking him about what, where, how, because there won't be a film if there's not this subjectivity, because this is not telling a story if you're not, although I never ask a question, every single frame of this 2 hours 22-minute film is who I am, and of course, I shot therapy for 9 months. There's 5, and then I followed them with their families for 4 years. There's 500 hours of material, and we edited. Isidore Bethel, my editor, who is from this country, we edited for 4 years, out of which he spent 2 years with us. There's again, when out of 500 hours, if you have 2 hours 22, it's always telling the story of the human being who is telling the story, as much as it's telling the story of the persons who are portrayed, and I think that's where the space is. But because we have to be clear about it. There is one day, and it's not that far away, when the war in Bosnia will be forgotten, the war in Iraq will be forgotten, Afghanistan. Not for the people who went for the war, but for the others. So if we want to tell stories that matter and that stayed, we have to have this in mind, because all our stories will fade away if not.
I'm excited too for the opportunity for these things to there shouldn't be this schism between when we hear about a suicide bombing, why are we not seeing, even if they published it 2 months before, the side video that has a more in-depth personal, I don't know, human story behind what it means to be there present at a bombing, or something that can help put it into context, even if it's former work. And I know that people will link to different stuff, but I think newspapers are getting better and better and magazines are getting better and better at making their web experience more fluid, and I hope that they take that into consideration. I think it also varies based on the newsroom, that there would be a section for documentary, and then a section, and then the rest of the paper is the facts, the news. And I don't see those things really all that far from each other. I never have. That was always something that here I was trying to explore, and have been in what I do, just how do we make documentary more integrated with the news, because I think it needs to be. And I don't think they're actually all that different. I think it comes down to the approach, though, and down to the journalist and recognizing their role in the filmmaking, which can be a lot more intimate than, say, the news reporting, maybe the facts.
Well, and that gets to an existential question for journalists. What you were talking about, Laurent, about owning that subjectivity, owning your place in that story and in that emotional space that you're creating. You're creating that occasion. I think that's an existential shift for a lot of people who were trained in a conventional journalistic practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the idea that you're just observing what is there and reporting what is there, but your point of view is going to be different from. And I think about the Ferguson panel yesterday that there was a moment where all of the panelists were talking about being in Ferguson and one being, behind the police lines with all the other journalists and seeing one part of the story, and the other who decided to break out of that and actually march with the protesters, and the different kind of side of the story that develops. And so no matter what, there's a perspective that is being told, and the editing work that you do in a film then too is you're telling a particular story. And I really appreciate, Laurent, that you said that this is also your story because it's your experience and and sitting there with the 500 hours of footage. So how did you approach then parsing out the stories to tell in your film, and how do you choose when you which lines of inquiry to follow? Especially, when thinking about, because violence is such a complex issue, how do you make those choices, or maybe in these two particular films you could talk about?
First of all, I just wanted to say also it's funny because back home I've been touring with this film now for 3 months, and I did 120 Q&As, and everywhere I'm kind of fighting with the words because people say you're documentary, or they call it documentariste in French, and I have to fight against that. I don't want to say I did a documentary. I made a film, and by saying so, it's not like, hey, I'm a filmmaker. It's just that I don't because when you open the TV program, every news feature news program is called a documentary, and with this, it is an objectivity that is most of this film are asking for, are saying that they are in the objectivity field, whereas all the time I feel I'm in the subjectivity field, and so I want it to be called a film because everything in the editing process is about this subjectivity again and again, but it has to be repeated, although it's obvious. But because, for instance, during the course of editing, we free ourselves from chronology, for instance,
yes,
and space, because I don't care about chronology and space, because I'm talking about the meaning of it and of what has been said in the room. All of us, when we process things, we're never thinking in terms of chronology or space. We are constantly dealing between the past and the present. All of the time, all the time we're doing that. So it's the same for my guys here, or the women I shot in Bosnia. And then I think what I'm trying to do in the editing process with the help of Isidore and the two other editors is, what is at stake for that person? What's his journey? And based on that, based on the perception of his or her truth, we're trying to tell the story, including our own truth, all the way through. But it's completely subjective. What is interesting is when they see the film, they take it as it was like that, because that means that we have found a way to tell their story their way, although it has nothing to do with the reality. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, I think you are.
But I'm answering the question I was asking myself.
Yeah.
So, shoot, I'm going back. I'm trying to think of the original question.
I was curious about how you, in the editing process, how do you, you have so many hours of film.
Oh, how do you choose the storylines?
Yeah.
Well, my process was super unique for frame by frame. We wanted to get away. I lived in New York and it was expensive and I knew I wasn't going to get paid for a while to work on this film. And so we're leaving, my husband and I were leaving anyway, and my co-director was like, come to Mexico and we'll edit in Baja. So we did this in Baja, which is kind of strange. But we day one got to Baja and got my IFP update from them that's filmmaker labs due in 6 days.
Oh, wow.
And we were like, oh, we really want to do the filmmaker labs. I don't know if you guys know about it, but IFP has this amazing program in New York that they bring the filmmakers in, and this is our first feature-length film, so we were like, oh, we really want to take this opportunity. So we wanted to have a chance at it, and we had, I don't know how many hours. I guess I don't know how many hours, but we had 7 terabytes of footage, unlogged, most of it untranslated. And we were like, oh, it requires a rough cut. What does that mean? And I'm like, deadline, because I was trained here. And so I got like so excited, and we dove in and used our gut more than we ever like would have otherwise, I think, because we would have just mulled over these things and like questioned ourselves. But because we only had 6 days to put together a rough cut from all this footage down to, it had to be less than 100 minutes. Or that was our goal. And so we used our gut on like everything. So then we look back at the IFP cut now, and we spent a whole year editing the film after that. Like, oh, well, you know, this is just IFP, which was like that's, by the way, a great way to get through like the daunting creative process, which I'm sure you already probably know, but is to be like, it's just a draft, and then power through. So, but we found that our instincts were like really correct in a lot of the things. Most of the film there was a lot of contextualizing that had to happen, a lot of interviews that had to be, like we had to figure out what exactly the storyline was for each character and who they really were coming across as in the film, which is like, that part of the work takes forever though, in terms of like putting together, so we used our gut on this IFP cut, right? But like, and that's the bones, but really, massaging the story to the point where like now I feel like I know this film like it's my child or something. Like I know it really, really well, but it took a long time to get there. Just up here, it just takes, I think, a long time to figure out who these people that you're trying to represent, because you have that responsibility to them. Most of you will never meet Farzana in person, but you'll get to meet her in a film, and like, what does that mean? Who is she as a person? And like, are we being as honest as we possibly can? Do we like consider there's a lot of, this is what makes it so subjective too, is like there's a lot that gets left out, of course, and there's a lot that gets included, and then in what order and sequence is it getting included? Like even in the editing process, we had a story architect, our story advisor, who would talk about sequencing a lot, that you feel this way when you watch this scene this time, but then we like switch the order up of the scenes in the film, and all of a sudden you don't feel that way anymore about that scene. You feel different about that person. You don't know why, and like now you feel like this, now you feel like they're a jerk, or like now you think, I'm not really sure like why he does it. You know, it's like every facet of it is so subjective. Yeah. But I don't think that every facet of a journalism story is not either. Like I think also, and in feature writing for sure, because they're like longer and you have more room there, but even in like the inverted pyramid, I still feel like it's very, like you're still going to glean, you're still looking through your eyes at what you're writing your notes about. You're still like coming from your place of whether privilege or marginalization or anywhere along that spectrum in the middle, you're still coming from that perspective when you show up. So who are you looking at? Who are you interviewing? What colors jumped out to you? All of this stuff is completely like, and we can put it in informational looking things and have an authoritative voice about it, but I think we also need to be honest with ourselves that we're still humans. We're still reporting things from our own lenses.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Have either of you, I'm interested, we're talking about stories about violence and listening to stories about violence, but I'm also interested in images of violence just as a piece of cinematic grammar. Have you, either of you or both of you, dealt with that? And how? At all?
For all what I said before, of course, since I was going to tell story through the words of the person, there would never be any illustration of that. And I think what matters is the images the viewers can manage to create in their own psyche. And filming through therapy and editing therapy, it has been a very analytical process, trying to create each, within the overall story, mini stories where the viewers can create their own representation based on who they are and where they come from. And for me, those images are much more powerful than any images. And because if we want to understand, we have to connect with the violence within, you know, and the violence within comes from the images we can we can manage to create for ourselves. And I think the words of the characters are helping them, of course, but it also helping us to create our own images. Because the other images, most of the time, we get prisoners of them. And they're not exactly what we bear, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That is a perfect point. Becoming prisoner of the image is a thing that all the photographers in my film deal with, like the fact that, you know, who's going to see this image? What are they going to think of Afghanistan? And so we kind of see it as, like, I guess it's too literal to say reframing, consider it's called frame by frame, but they're kind of reframing the narrative of their country through photographs. But always grappling with, like, a lot of the same issues that we're talking about now, which are when you take a photograph of atrocity and that makes it on the newswire, and then you are like, yes, I got the information out to the world, and I got, you know, people got to see this awful thing that was happening in my country, and they should know, you know, and but then dealing with the aftermath that, like, that there were humans involved in that atrocity that you photographed, and what does that really mean for you as a person, and what does that mean for you if you got famous because of it? One of the characters is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and his name is Masood Hosseini, and he's the first Afghan to ever, and only Afghan to win the Pulitzer Prize, and his prize-winning photograph is a breaking news photograph of a girl screaming in the center of, basically, it's exactly an image of violence. It's this girl screaming after a bombing had leveled all these people at this religious ceremony in Afghanistan, mostly children and women, like, around her. And so it's an awful picture. It's, like, hard for Masood to look at his own picture, but he had to, like, he felt like he had to do it, you know? And then he grapples with, I mean, the film talks about this, you should see the film, but, but I guess, like, I think, I don't know, I mean, I think photography, at the same time that it can hold you prisoner, it can also capture something in a way that you can't forget, in a way that, I mean, I think visual storytelling is so important. I do think that forming, you know, an image through one's own articulation and their own thoughts and their own feelings about what happened to them is so important. But I also see a really special place for photography, for that image being something that represents what you, like, couldn't wrap your head around, what you, like, you know, what will inform you more of the humanness behind a story. It can be that if it's done really well. And so photography can be this kind of, I think photography is more haunting even than video for that reason. And obviously I made a film about photographers, so I must think it's really important. But I see it as a really special thing, and you see that people have taken notice of, and not just notice, they've reflected on things due to seeing a photographer cover it in a certain way that makes them do that, you know, and I think that's really special part of that medium.
Yeah, I think of the iconic image of the Afghan girl.
Right.
That has, I mean, stirred, you know, a long time ago,
right,
people to care, and then again, you know, post 9/11, as being this powerful image.
Well, all of Steve McCurry's photos from Afghanistan were,
yes.
We were looking for doing a motion graphic at the beginning of the film to give context to Afghanistan and through photography, and we ended up using the Afghan girl. But
oh, did you? Yeah.
But yeah, it was like we have to, because people, like, we want to remind people. The motion graphic now is about, like, kind of reminding the audience what are your perceptions of Afghanistan, what are the stories you're hearing, because you're about to hear something that might challenge that, or that, you know, start thinking about it. Okay, that's what we're doing. But anyway, the photography that Steve McCurry did of Afghanistan, those images outside of the Afghan girl, if you look them up, they're, like, some of the most amazing images in terms of showing this sense of place of Afghanistan that if he hadn't captured it, like, there was nobody shooting photos at the time. There was just a really small number of people, and then the Taliban banned photography after that. And I think that's another thing to be said about the power of images, even if they are violent images, is that they're proof. And they don't always help, like, in a sense of us understanding what's happening, but they do act as proof that it happened. Mm-hmm. And that's something that was ripped away from Afghanistan during the Taliban. And I mean, one of our photographers went so far as to say, it told us, like, one night, that he doesn't think that they would have been able to do the things they've done had there been people armed with cameras. So I think that there's that witness aspect too of violent images that we can't ignore, even if they are maybe, I don't know, perpetuating a violence-driven, narrative. They do act as proof. So
We have 2 more clips from you. Did you want us to show one of them at all at this point?
I don't know. I feel like they might be off topic at this point,
Okay.
actually,
Just
because they're
making
not about
sure.
violence at all.
Okay, great. Yes, that would be great. Excellent.
Okay, I promise not to monopolize the microphone just because I have it. I will pass it around. The first, I have a statement and a question. This has been really fascinating panel. And Lauren, I'm sorry for trapping you in a conference for journalism and documentary, both of you, in which you try to avoid. So I saw American Sniper in the theaters, and I think that your film, the clips that I've seen would be excellent bookends for anyone going to see American Sniper. Kind of seeing yours first and seeing yours after would really round out that experience and improve it. But this idea of becoming prisoner of an image. In the class that Brad Prager and I teach, we often talk with our students about violence and graphic images or graphic video, and thinking about this both as coming from a journalistic perspective and an artistic perspective. Can you talk a little bit about how you might make decisions about something that is graphic for the sake of being graphic versus graphic for imparting a story? And I'm thinking of, just again, back to this idea of being prisoner of an image and what goes too far and I just wonder if you have any strategies for making those kinds of decisions. And Anne, this could also apply to you with your background in journalism, I'm not sure.
That's a question I would ask. So, thank you.
Well, I mean, in the film, we have a sequence of photos that are violent because they were documented by someone who was experiencing them. And damn, I don't want to give it away. Don't tell anyone I said this. One of the characters, the Pulitzer Prize winner, was shooting video when the bomb went off of the Pulitzer Prize winning photo. And I just lose it every time I watch it, which has been now probably 700 times. The fact that his video is on and you can hear him sobbing as he's shooting. And I think that we knew that this video existed, and he had said, I remember watching the video later and I was crying in it, and I just had to think about, what did this mean? What was I doing? Why was I still there? What just happened? And he was grappling with all these questions. And so we were struggling so hard with how do we reveal this image that, is a violent image. And the images, we wanted to also reveal the images taken before and after it, because we also think that there's the whole prisoner of an image thing there's this perception that there was one picture, so therefore that's the only frame of reference of the entire attack, when in reality there were all these other shots that were just not as compelling, and they paint a bigger picture of there actually weren't as many people, or there were more people, or whatever else. So I think the solution for me in editing that scene, which was really hard to do because you just didn't want to objectify this awful violent event and feed the monster of us being more violence, of course this is Afghanistan. I didn't want it to just be, it's supposed to be about Masood. It's supposed to be about why he felt he had to do this. And so that video of him crying was the best way, I think. It really offered this way for us to reveal the human side of it, because he can talk about it all day long. He's actually very good at talking about it because he won a Pulitzer Prize and he had to talk about it a lot. And he can get more intimate about it when he talks about it, but there's something about just hearing him and knowing the pain of actually being there, and no matter how great the image was, what goes into getting that image. So that was our solution, I guess, for that.
One, in terms of my point of view as a critic, and I think maybe the way I can contribute is what I would consider gratuitous versus meaningful. I guess that's the framework I use in calling somebody out on or not, or praising. And I think it's just what you were describing and what you do, Laurent, which is kind of break through our own desensitization and our own, the expectations and assumptions we've built up by this language that we've been steeped in, that you're interrupting it and you're disrupting it and you're actually throwing us back on ourselves, emotion, and just restoring the emotional meaning. Mm-hmm. It's just it's about restoration of something that's been just leached out by the apparatus of media.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's not only that we are prisoners of images, but I think that images of violence where most of the time we're like the rabbit in front of the lights of the car, and there's a morbid attraction, and we're fascinated. But and when I say that it takes us away from our own experience, it's because we're alive, and in the course of the first film in Bosnia, I went with one of the characters who was in therapy to the opening of a mass grave, and where her husband most probably was, and we filmed that, and I know what I experienced, and perhaps I kind of understood somewhere what she understood, but there was nowhere, and it didn't come into my mind that I would use these images and show them to the public, because but that's where I come from, and that's how I've been thinking of my work for the past 20 years. What I'm interested in is about living and surviving, and which is, that's what all of us are doing, and that's where we come from. And so I think that there is a lot of the morbid fascination in a lot of images of violence, and we should really be careful. You were mentioning 9/11. We all have all these images, and there is a fascination about those two planes entering the towers. But the story that really moved me the most about the 9/11, I think it was carried by the Washington Post. It was built up with the messages people left on the answering machine of their loved ones when they were trapped in the buildings, and it was, to me, it's, how do you call it? It was about. It's the only thing I wanted to hear about this. How people were still at the very last minute and second, they were still alive and they were fighting for it, and they did it so by their love messages on the answering machines. I found it really, whereas the other images we have, they trap us in the morbid attraction.
I didn't think I'd cry so much during this panel. I know. I cheered up like
This may seem like an odd question in light of the filmmakers we have here and the topics we've talked about, but I'm thinking about the most talked about and acclaimed documentaries from last year, and there really weren't a lot of violent topics. I think about Citizen4, The Overnighters, Life Itself, things like that. Those are not violent films and not specifically about violence. So is there a tendency for people really to want that sort of film, to want it too much, or is there not enough attention being paid for that? I know that's just one year and a few examples I hold out, but I wonder what the public's appetite is for this, and even the critics.
That's an interesting observation. There are two movies. Well, Central Park 5 is one movie that played opening night here that I think engages those issues and those images. And there's also a movie called Tales of the Grim Sleeper, which is playing here, which takes a very lurid. It's about a serial murder. It's about a series of murders in L.A. Wherein the victims were African American women, who, the crimes were completely ignored by the media, which was hungry for, white women victims. Like, you give me a white, the bleeds it leads ethos, which is, really predicated on privileging white victimhood and engaging paranoia about race. And so, there is this sort of lurid material in that movie, but it's contextualized within this larger question about media responsibility and what counts as a story and what's legitimized as a story about loss and, you know, that's worth grieving in our culture. But yeah, that's a good. I don't know if that's just a, you know, I don't know if it's a public appetite question as much as it's maybe a temperamental question with filmmakers and their individual what stories they're attracted to telling.
I think in general we don't give audiences, I guess, people enough credit that they actually don't need to see violent images. They actually, while it's alluring, I think we don't give people the benefit of the doubt that, like, we can tell a more human story and they'll be engaged and they'll learn something and they'll want to pay attention to what's happening. At least I hope. Ask me in a year after nobody's watched frame by frame or cares about it. And then, no, but that was something that was huge for our film. Is I was like, you know, we don't want to lead with violent images. We don't really want to explore the violence. We didn't really cover the war. You don't see a U.S. soldier in our film about Afghanistan. They're there. Actually, there weren't that many of them while we were there, but in places we were. But yeah, I think in general, like, I don't think we give people enough benefit of the doubt that they would watch the clip, Lorenz's clip, and that they would. That would be like something that viewers would want to see. Like that, I think that we just, I don't know why, but we kind of go back to the bleeds it leads ethos, and I don't think that we need to. I think we could actually do well without it, but nobody's willing to give it a shot. There's like, everyone's competing now for dollars in journalism, so I don't think anyone's willing to take the risk to be like the big risk of being like, we just won't cover it that way, okay? We're gonna cover like a bigger story about what's happening here, and some people are doing it, like doing it well in like news startups, but they don't have a lot of support and money. They're doing it out of passion, so.
This is something that I have a lot of journalism students in my classes right now. I'm teaching a course called Writing Human Rights, and we're exploring, you know, how human rights issues are represented, and they're getting sort of the single story that tends to be told about human rights violations, and they want to complicate it, but they're like, the story will never sell. This is the problem, is we're stuck in the system. How do we get out of it? Because we need to make a living. And so I think that that's a real situation that journalists face.
Yeah.
Brad.
Thanks. This is such a fascinating conversation, and I mean, thank you so much for being here. Just watching the clips, Laurent and Mo, they're totally beautiful. I mean, even in these, you know, couple minutes, and I know that can be frustrating for a filmmaker who makes a film about a serious topic or about the effects of violence to be told that they've made a beautiful film. And I'm wondering if you struggle as filmmakers against beauty. I mean, again, you know, there's a way in which testimony, it can be so fascinating and so beautiful and so poetic. And I think also of Claude Lanzmann, you know, as another example, and he gets very upset when people say, you know, oh, this is aesthetic. And he says, no, there's nothing aesthetic in my work, but we all know the effect of watching those close-ups, that it's very beautiful. And I think, Mo, with, you know, the still image and the moving image, there's something you've done that's really beautiful in there. And I wonder, I mean, do you fight against the aesthetic? Do you ever find yourself in a position where you say, I've made this too beautiful?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think with this film in particular, I do a lot with shooting like with shallow lenses on a DSLR. It's like gorgeous event, like, and I do struggle with that on stories that I've shot in developing countries where things are not, like I shot a story post-cholera crisis in Sierra Leone, and it was like really kind of beautiful to watch, I guess. It was like really vibrant and like lots of tight shots that were very like, ooh. But like Mayama, the girl in the story, lived in a slum that was not beautiful, and she didn't think it was beautiful. So it wasn't like, there's beauty everywhere, so you can capture it anywhere. But and so that was kind of a conflict for me with that one. But with this film, I think it was informed by the beauty. We showed up in Afghanistan and we were like, what? Nobody does this. Like, nobody tells us about this. Are you kidding me? There's swan boats on lakes? Like, what? And we were just so surprised, because I know that there's beauty everywhere in the world, but it's just that we literally never ever see it coming from Afghanistan in like a news context. And so, and everything, it's always hearing about dry, dusty everything because the troops are usually on a base that's like out of a lot of these really beautiful places. So, but really it was informed by what the photographers were attracted to in the film, and then was informed by our own. We're definitely subjective in the film in a sense that like, this is a beautiful film on purpose. And we shot it to be cinematic in a beautiful way because we want you to feel like we did when we were there. It felt like that. Like everything felt like it was opening up in front of us in frames, and the light was diffused through this like really light dust and cobble, and the mountains were towering over us, and it was just like, whoa. So with that film, I guess I'd be okay if someone's like, it's beautiful. I'm like, good. But yeah, I think it can be a conflict sometimes because, I don't know, because you're like, that's a nice little story. It like kind of undercuts the rawness of some of the things that you're trying to cover. And so I think a lot of that is in editing, I've realized too, is I'm realizing more and more how like sharp editing isn't always like, even if it's rhythmically, you're like, I'm watching, I'm paying attention the whole time. Because I also make like promotional, or I used to make promotional films with nonprofits. That's like how I made any money, because journalism doesn't pay very much, unfortunately. So with those, it's like really easy to get rhythmic with the editing and like beautiful imagery and da-da-da. And I just am like about it sometimes because it shouldn't, I mean, it should be cinematic in the sense that you should be paying attention the whole time. But I think there's something big to be said about just leaving the shot, like leaving it on someone's face as something's happening, just like watching and witnessing something, and you forget about, the aesthetic of it because the content itself is informing you. So that was a long answer, sorry.
I think in both my films, if ever there's beauty, it comes really from the fact that my characters are so much connected with their inner self, and they're so articulated about it, and that really gives us a feeling of beauty. And of course, because of that, because of this quest that is theirs, we owe them nice frames also. We cannot just, so we work, because that's our work, on doing so. But then when we edit, we are driven more by this inner beauty that I was talking about, more than the beauty of the frame. And it was never, for us, a question, should we keep this frame because it's beautiful or not? And I can tell you a small story. One of the female characters of the first film, Yasmina is her name, she actually now lives in Kentucky for the past 10 years, but she's Bosnian. When I showed her the film for the first time, after the screening, she came to me and she said, yeah, therapy, yeah, but I'm not that beautiful in real life, And it was really moving because she felt, that, of course, that was not, but for us, she was that beautiful because of what she was capable of articulating about herself.
I'm thinking of it also from the point of view of the viewer. I mean, at some point, you're mediating. You're accountable to your subjects, but you're also trying to connect the audience emotionally, and pleasure is a part of that. Visual pleasure, sensory pleasure, and that's a part of the equation that you have to be aware of and engage with unashamedly. And I think, I guess another way of saying this is what we're going for, what I'm going for as a critic is catharsis. We want that catharsis, which is different than the zing, different than the hit, different than the fix, and beauty that's where the beauty happens.
Other questions?
This question is for Laurent. Do you have any insight as to how people can kill people close at hand. I mean, the killings that take place at 30,000 feet are one thing, but what happened in the Balkan Wars, killing 7,500 Muslim men and boys just because they were the enemy or because they were Muslims or for whatever reason, it seems almost unbelievable that anyone could do that, and yet it happens, not only there, but in other places as well.
So, what would be the question? Sorry.
Do you have any insight as to how people can do that, how they suspend their morality during times of conflict so that they can do things that were probably unthinkable before the war happened?
I don't know. But I must add one thing. Of course, my deep belief about the men I have followed in therapy here in this country is that none of them committed a war crime. They killed in the course of the war because they were at war and they were soldiers. But I don't know. I'm only interested in the ones I have followed, so I cannot talk for the others. But for the ones I have followed, I would say that. But that's my feeling. I never asked them. Whenever they were in position to, and whenever they did kill someone else, they killed themselves first, in the sense of, that's what happened to them. It became that, and that's what I observed of the experience, and that's the only thing I can tell you. But it's a wound for a human person that is very difficult to represent to ourselves,
I'm sure you've been asked this many times, Laurent, and my question will be richer after I've seen the film today at 2:00. But did you find that as a French filmmaker documenting American soldiers, did you find that the conclusions you were drawing about men in war were universal, or did you think it was very particular to how America approaches war?
I never thought of this project as a project made by a French filmmaker in America. It was the project of the grandson of two veterans who never spoke to their wives or kids or grandkids about their experience of war, made with young veterans exactly the same age as my grandfathers, who were coming back and trying to address the issue. And I think that's how they took my presence as well, and that's why the film was possible.
Other questions?
Because the film is, of course, for me, out of context, and what matters is, again, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, what it is to be a young man, go to war and come back. I think the rest of it, as far as the psyche is concerned, the trauma happens whatever the war is about. If you're on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, and your friends are blowing around you, and you might be the next one, and you shit on yourself for 8 hours, literally, the fact that you're in a just war and you're freeing Europe from Nazism doesn't change the way your psyche is traumatized by the experience. So I'm not really, I'm a political scientist by education, and I'm an historian by education as well. So I'm interested, but this is something else, whereas I'm really focusing on the universality of the story of the young warrior.
I was just wondering, therapy, psychotherapy, individual group psychotherapy, it's a very private enterprise, and there's a lot of confidentiality associated with it, a higher degree in terms of releasing mental health information. So I was wondering what was involved with getting consent, not just from an individual, but from a group, and then in two very different countries.
Yeah, it's a long story. In both cases, before starting to shoot, I grounded myself in not only in the country, but in the issue, and then in the institution with no camera. And then when the patient arrived, I built up a relationship. Of course, they knew I was a filmmaker, but first of all, they understood the legitimacy of my presence in the first film, because I had my own experience of war in Bosnia. It was not the same as the ladies, because I didn't lose anyone there, but I was under the same bombs, and so we had something in common, and even though our quests were different, we had somewhat a similar quest also in trying to find some meaning. It's a bit the same in this country with the men, but also there was this question of the grandfathers, and each and every one of the guys who had kids, they knew perfectly that they were already passing on the effects of trauma to the next generation. So having in front of them somebody from the third generation coming and say, hey, you're right. You're right in addressing the issue, because this is going to be passed on to the following generations. That is something that was, understood and built up also the legitimacy of my presence. But to really answer your question, I would need to talk a lot about how the camera is playing a role in the therapeutic process, and perhaps we don't have time for that, but I will address it, I guess, in the Q&As after the screenings. But what I can say is that if it hadn't been clear for each and every one of the patients I filmed that the camera was part of the process, it wouldn't have been possible to make these films. And this goes much beyond the question of getting a formal release, And I never ask release before filming. I do ask when it's completely over. So not the editing, but the filming.
Any other questions? Oh,
yeah. I've seen a lot of movies at True False over the years, and I think before I kind of experienced some trauma in my own life, I was able to better digest the emotional kind of impact that films might leave me with. So I'm curious, and this may be a difficult question to answer, but if you're presenting a movie that includes a lot of death or the worst that humanity has to offer, what is it that you want your viewer to take away from that? Is it awareness? Is it action? Just curious.
Well, as for my films, the subjectivity comes in the fact that I'm addressing the question of war through a very specific lens, which is individuals who chose to process in therapy and try to find words to express their experience of trauma, meaning that all these characters who are on the border, on the borderline between the attraction to death and the desire of living, have chosen to go one step in the direction of living and surviving the experience of the war. So the stories I'm telling is this story for surviving, and it's very uplifting, I think, for the audience.
I guess I would say the same for me too, like in terms of surviving, like focusing on the survivors, and I don't know, awareness, and it's been interesting to like, we just finished our final cut yesterday, so I'm like, still processing how outreach is going to work for our film, but It'll be my first time for a feature-length film, but I do know the grant writing process for trying to raise money for outreach, and it very much focuses on like the awareness term and the action term and like what kind of film are you guys making, and I struggle with that because I'm just like, well, I don't have an action for you. I really don't want you to just like pour money into some organization that says they're doing things for Afghans, because that's actually hurt Afghanistan a lot in the past. I don't want to give like a catch-all answer to solving. There is no like catch-all answer to solving the fact that it's dangerous to be a photojournalist in Afghanistan, but also in a lot of places in the world. So I have a hard time with that action point. And at the same time, like you feel a responsibility that if people are going to see your film, they do want to know like what to do, you know? So I think it's a hard, I guess my answer is I think it's a hard thing right now. I hope it facilitates dialogue and starts getting people questioning like what the point of photojournalism and journalism is and why we need it, and maybe why a local storyteller is an important part of the narrative of what we're hearing from a country and what we get from paying attention to a local storyteller versus a foreign media agency or something, even if they work for foreign agencies. But yeah, so it's just a hard thing to grasp in terms of saying what I'm trying to get the audience to glean besides that. I definitely want that, the conversation thing.
You know, this reminds me of something Josh Oppenheimer has talked a lot about around the act of killing, which is, and has those same, you know, I think there's this sort of participant model now after the Inconvenient Truth, which is, you know, we all know that visual language, you know, which is very effective, and it's very, you know, they've made it into its own genre, really. But I sense that's really kind of colonized, you know, the funding world, and you know, it's true of even like of all art forms now. They have to be educational. It's a very utilitarian model to metrics and all of that language, you know. And what I felt from both of your pieces was just, and I think Josh does this too, is really resisting that, and because I think that gets into that instrumentality that bothers me about, like, we'll show these violent images and get people all hyped up and then hit them with the stinger, you know,
right,
like we'll get them with the, you know, and it's just like, I'm almost as offended by that as I am by, you know, the most gratuitous uses of violence in pop culture, you know, it's just as kind of objectifying and manipulative. And rather than, as you do, let us sit with this, you know, like let this audience sit with this emotional experience. And again, it's about listening, period. You know, it's just like maybe it's just the opportunity to listen to one another is enough. You know, can it be? Is that justifiable?
Yeah, I just wanted to add in something to my answer, is that the subjectivity in the context of my film plays also in the editing, where we emphasize this part of the journey towards life of each of the patients, because most of the material we shot has a lot of morbidity in it, and what we were digging for in this immense material was where was life, you know, and where was hope, because these guys, or these women in Bosnia, they went through therapy in seeking their own life, or the life they could have after what they went through. So we have kind of a duty to give them back that part of the story, because that's what they were seeking for, and it is in the material. But this is subjective in the editing process. We could as well, you know, focus on the morbidity of what was said in therapy. But that wouldn't be fair at all. It would be criminal against these characters.
Mo, I noticed...
And the audience, sorry.
Mo, I noticed a little bit of music in the clip that you showed us. Obviously, haven't seen the film, but I'd be interested to hear about how you view the music as a tool, either for yourself or for the viewer, as far as making connections between the still photography and the interview footage or the moving footage. And then, Laurent, am I correct in understanding you do not add music in post-production, don't use titles, this kind of thing?
I don't use titles, but I don't use commentary, but I use music in a very specific way.
Okay, I'd love to hear then just what ways those are. Thanks.
I think, yeah, we have music. We had it originally composed, and we were inspired to get it originally composed by the composer himself because he could lend gravity to things that we felt needed it, in a sense. And music is so subjective, so it's like super slippery slope that we loved walking, actually, because we developed a sound for each character, and we felt like it was a very storytelling. It was a storytelling decision that we purposely made about this film specifically. Had it been a more, I would say about at least half the film is verite, and we don't use music in verite. So the interviews and things that we felt like. It's not even just lending gravity to it. I think it like helped develop your sense of who that person, what that person, I don't know. The tones helped develop that person a little bit and get like tie their story together. We followed 4 people in like one 85-minute film. So it also helped with like, you definitely know the difference between all of them, but it kind of brings you back into their world to hear their tone again, so.
In both my film, it's a very famous Turkish composer of Sufi music, who is the 5th generation of a composer. And before I even started filming, and before the institution where I filmed in America was created, I have asked him the music, and telling him that what I was seeking for was a sound environment that would, for the viewer, convey the idea that although the guys are back here, their spirit is always there on the front line. It was a mixture of war sounds and music from over there and sounds from over there. And so we have 3 pieces of music that are really here as music in the film, but the rest of it is only addressed to the unconscious of the viewer. And it was frustrating, I guess, for the composer, but we just took bites and we really mixed very, very, you can't say where it is when you watch the film, but it's always there. Some sounds, and we're trying to build up for the viewer this idea that they're never back home, using the music as well as the rest.
Oh, I should say we licensed a couple of tracks from the Elvis of Afghanistan, like fun stuff.
Before I turn it back to Rebecca, I would like to revise my previous statement for the record. I suggested that Frame by Frame and Of Men in War be bookends for American Sniper, but rather yours should be the main course, and maybe American Sniper should be a bookend for your film. So sorry about that. Back to you, Rebecca.
Can we use some of their funds for marketing strategy?
I think we're out of time, right? So thank you all for sticking out to the end. I know that True False is on the horizon and films are beginning, so very exciting. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, too. Yeah, this was great.